The music had not even finished playing when Cale Draven felt his chest tighten, as if an invisible hand had closed around his heart. He stood at the back of the grand hall, dressed in black, his face calm on the outside, while something wild stirred inside him. The scent reached him first, carried on the warm air of the crowded room, and it hit him harder than any blow he had taken in battle. It was a scent he had memorized long ago, and had never truly forgotten, no matter how many years had passed. His wolf rose beneath his skin, pushing against his control, howling silently for something it had lost and never stopped searching for. Cale gripped the edge of the marble pillar beside him, forcing his breathing to stay even. Around him, guests whispered and smiled, unaware that the most powerful man in the room was fighting to keep himself from shaking. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Pax, ruler of lands that stretched from the mountains to the sea, a man who commanded fear and respect with a single glance. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the pull in his chest, the ancient bond that every wolf carried, and few were lucky enough to feel completed. He had felt it once before, 5 years ago, and then it had vanished, torn away in a single terrible night that still haunted his dreams. He had told himself she was gone. He had told his advisors, his pack, and even himself that his mate had died in the attack that took so much from him. He had built walls around that pain and buried it beneath duty and command, and now, without warning, the bond was alive again, pulsing through him like a heartbeat that was not his own. He turned his head slowly, scanning the crowd, his golden eyes moving past nobles and pack leaders, past servants carrying trays of wine, past children peeking out from behind their parents' legs. The scent grew stronger with every second, pulling him forward like a rope tied around his ribs. And then he saw her. She stood at the front of the hall, near the raised platform where the ceremony was about to take place, dressed in a gown of white and silver that caught the light with every small movement. Her hair was pulled back in soft waves, and her hands were folded in front of her, holding a small bouquet of pale flowers. She was breathtaking, but it was not her beauty that stopped Cale's heart. It was her face. It was the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way she stood with quiet strength, even though something in her posture suggested she did not fully understand where she was, or why her heart was racing. It was her. After 5 years of silence, after 5 years of believing the bond had died with her, she was standing right there, alive and breathing, close enough that he could cross the room in a few strides and take her hand. His feet moved before his mind gave the order. He stepped forward, weaving through the crowd, ignoring the surprised glances of nobles who bowed as he passed. Nothing mattered except reaching her. Nothing mattered except confirming with his own eyes that this was not some cruel trick of his mind, some dream born from years of longing. But before he could take more than a few steps, the doors at the side of the platform opened, and a hush fell over the room. The ceremony was beginning. A man stepped out to stand beside her, tall and composed, dressed in fine formal clothing, his expression calm and confident as he took his place at her side. Cale froze in place, his blood turning cold as recognition crashed into him. He knew that face. He had known it since childhood, though the years and distance had changed it. It was the face of Ronan Voss, his half-brother, the man he had exiled from the kingdom years ago after discovering a betrayal that had nearly cost Cale his throne and his life. Ronan had vanished after his banishment, and Cale had assumed he had fled far beyond the borders of the Northern Pax, never to return. Yet here he was, standing at the front of a grand hall, about to marry the woman who was Cale's fated mate. The pieces did not fit together in Cale's mind, and for a long moment he simply stood frozen, staring at the two of them, as the priest began to speak the opening words of the ceremony. His wolf raged inside him, demanding he move, demanding he claim what belonged to him, but years of discipline held him in place. He needed to understand what was happening before he acted. He needed to know how his mate, presumed dead for 5 years, had ended up standing beside his exiled brother, about to become his wife. The woman on the platform did not know his name. He could see it in the calm, unaware way she stood, in the polite smile she offered to the priest, in the way her eyes occasionally drifted toward the crowd without any sign of recognition. Whatever bond connected them, whatever pull had brought his wolf roaring to the surface, she felt none of it. Or if she did not understand what it meant. Cale's mind raced back through the years, searching for any clue he might have missed. 5 years ago, His pack had been attacked during a routine patrol near the eastern border. The attackers had come without warning, moving with skill that suggested they were not simple rogues, but trained fighters, working for someone with resources and purpose. In the chaos of that night, his mate, a young woman named Illyra, who had only recently discovered her connection to him, had been separated from the group. When the fighting ended and the smoke cleared, she was nowhere to be found. Search parties had combed the forests for weeks. They found signs of a struggle, torn cloth, and traces of blood, but no body, and no further trace of her. Eventually, the search was called off, and the official record stated that she was presumed dead, likely killed, and her remains taken by scavengers before anyone could find her. Cale had never fully believed it. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of him had always felt that the story did not add up, that something about her disappearance felt wrong. But grief and the weight of ruling a kingdom had forced him to accept the official version, if only so he could continue functioning as a leader. He had thrown himself into his duties, refusing every attempt his advisors made to introduce him to potential matches, insisting that his heart belonged to a memory, rather than risking it on someone new. His pack had watched him grow colder and more distant with each passing year, and though none dared say it aloud, many worried that their king would spend the rest of his life alone, married only to his throne and his grief. Now standing in this hall, watching the woman he had mourned prepare to marry another man, Cale understood that everything he had believed about that night 5 years ago might have been a lie. The priest's voice continued, moving through the traditional words of the ceremony, but Cale barely heard them. His attention was fixed entirely on Illyra's face, searching for any flicker of memory, any sign that some part of her recognized him standing in the crowd. For a moment, just a moment, her eyes swept past where he stood, and he saw her pause. Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she had caught the edge of a thought she could not quite grasp. Then Ronan said something quietly to her, and she turned back to him, the strange moment passing as quickly as it had come. Cale's hands curled into fists at his sides. He needed to stop this. He needed to speak before the words of the ceremony bound her to a man who, if Cale's suspicions were correct, might have played some part in what happened to her 5 years ago. But interrupting a wedding of this scale, in front of so many nobles and pack leaders from across the region, was not a decision to be made lightly. If he was wrong, if his instincts were leading him astray, the consequences could be severe, both politically and personally. Alliances could crumble. War could follow. But if he was right, and he said nothing, he would be allowing his mate to bind herself forever, to the very man who might have taken her from him. He thought of the years of silence, the empty nights in his private chambers, the way he had trained himself not to imagine what her voice sounded like, what her laugh might have felt like against his skin. He thought of every birthday he had marked in secret, every anniversary of the night she vanished, every time his advisors had gently suggested he move forward, and every time he had refused. He had not moved forward because some part of him had never believed she was truly gone. And now here she stood, breathing, alive, close enough to touch, and he was about to lose her all over again unless he acted. The priest asked if there was anyone present who objected to the union, a formality rarely taken seriously in modern ceremonies, more tradition than expectation. The room fell into the practiced silence that always followed such a question, guests exchanging polite, knowing smiles, certain that no one would actually speak. Cale opened his mouth to interrupt. Before he could, movement near the front of the hall caught his eye. A woman standing close to Illyra, dressed as one of her attendants, glanced nervously toward the doors, then toward Ronan, then finally toward the crowd. Her expression carried a tension that did not match the joyful atmosphere expected at a wedding. She looked as though she were bracing for something to go wrong, as though she already knew something the rest of the room did not. Cale filed the observation away, his mind sharpening with the instincts that had kept him alive through years of political conflict and battlefield command. Something was wrong here, something deeper than his own personal shock at finding his mate alive. The nervous attendant, the strange timing of this wedding, his exiled brother suddenly reappearing after years of silence, all of it pointed toward a larger scheme, one that had likely begun the night Illyra disappeared. He needed proof before he acted, but he also could not simply stand by and watch the ceremony continue. His wolf would not allow it, and honestly, neither would he. Whatever plan Ronan had constructed, whatever lies had been told to bring them to this moment, Cale refused to let it play out to its conclusion, without at least giving Alira the chance to know the truth, even if she chose to reject it afterward. He stepped forward again, more purposefully this time, drawing the attention of several nearby guests who turned to watch him with confused expressions. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized him, murmuring his name and title, wondering why the Alpha King of the Northern Pax would be moving toward the front of a wedding that, as far as any of them knew, had nothing to do with him. Alira's gaze swept the room again, this time landing directly on him. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Cale watched something shift behind her expression. It was not full recognition, not yet, but it was something. A flicker of confusion, a brief, involuntary catch of breath. Her hand tightened slightly around the bouquet she held, and for the briefest instant, the color drained from her face. She felt it too. Whatever bond connected them, whatever pull had drawn Cale halfway across the hall without conscious thought, she was beginning to feel its echo, even if she did not understand what it meant. Ronan noticed the shift in her attention and followed her gaze, his composed expression faltering the moment he saw Cale standing there. For just a fraction of a second, something dangerous flashed across his face, quickly hidden behind a practiced smile, but Cale saw it clearly. It was fear. Not surprise, not confusion, but genuine fear, the kind a man wears when a carefully built lie is about to collapse. The priest, sensing the sudden tension in the room, paused mid-sentence, glancing uncertainly between the groom and the unexpected disturbance rippling through the crowd. Guests began murmuring more loudly now, some standing to get a better view, others whispering questions to their neighbors about who this newcomer was and why his presence had caused such a visible reaction from the groom. Cale reached the edge of the platform, close enough now that he could see the fine details of Alira's face, the small scar near her hairline that had not been there 5 years ago, the way her fingers trembled slightly around the flowers she held. Up close, the pull of the bond was almost overwhelming, a physical ache that settled deep in his chest and refused to ease. "Alira," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the sudden silence of the hall. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in years, and it felt strange and familiar all at once, like recovering a language he had once been fluent in and had nearly forgotten. She flinched at the sound of her own name spoken by a stranger, her eyes widening as something inside her seemed to stir, some buried memory pushing against the surface of her mind. "Do I know you?" she asked, her voice unsteady, caught between confusion and a fear she could not explain. Before Cale could answer, Ronan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Alira and the edge of the platform, his hand moving protectively, almost possessively, toward her arm. "This is not the time or place for whatever this is," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You are disrupting my wedding, Cale. I suggest you leave before this becomes a scene neither of us wants." "You know exactly why I am here," Cale replied, his eyes never leaving Ronan's face. "And I think you know exactly who she is." The room had gone completely silent now, every guest hanging on the exchange, sensing that something far larger than a simple interruption was unfolding before them. Alira looked between the two men, her breathing quickening, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch the small scar near her hairline, as though some distant, buried instinct told her it was connected to whatever was happening in this moment. "I don't understand," she whispered, more to herself than to either man standing before her. "What is happening? Why does my chest feel like this?" Cale took a slow step closer, ignoring the tension radiating from Ronan beside her. "Because 5 years ago, you were taken from me," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of grief and hope tangled together. "And I have spent every single day since believing you were dead." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Alira's face went pale, her hand pressing against her chest, as though trying to steady a heart that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Memories she could not place, feelings she could not explain, and a stranger's voice that somehow felt like coming home. All of it crashed into her at once, and for the first time since stepping onto that platform, she felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to shift. The wedding, she realized with a growing sense of dread, was no longer simply a wedding. It had become the opening moment of a truth she had never known she was missing, and there was no going back to the life she had believed was hers just moments before. Alira's ears rang, as though the entire hall had gone underwater. She looked down at her own hands, at the bouquet trembling between her fingers, and wondered why a stranger's words felt more real, than the vows she had rehearsed 100 times in the mirror. Beside her, Ronan's grip tightened, almost imperceptibly on her arm, a small pressure that somehow felt colder than the marble floor beneath her feet. "Illyra, look at me," Ronan said, his voice smooth and urgent, the practiced calm of a man trying to steer a runaway carriage back onto its path. "This man is a stranger to you. He is confused, or worse, he means to cause trouble on our wedding day, out of some old grudge. Do not let him plant doubts in your mind." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to nod, take his hand, and return to the ceremony as though nothing had happened. But the stranger's eyes held hers with a steadiness that felt nothing like confusion, and the ache, spreading through her chest, refused to fade, no matter how many times she told herself it meant nothing. "Why does my scar feel warm?" she asked quietly, touching the faint mark near her hairline again. A mark she had been told since childhood came from a fall she could not remember. "Why does my heart feel like it's trying to leave my body?" Cale watched her fingers brush against the small scar, and something in his chest twisted painfully. He recognized the mark instantly. It was in the exact place where, 5 years ago, a rogue's claw had grazed her during the attack that separated them. A wound he had watched a healer stitch closed, with trembling hands, while praying she would survive the night. Seeing it now, faded but present, confirmed everything his instincts had already told him. This was not a woman who merely resembled his lost mate. This was Illyra, alive, standing in front of him after 5 years of silence. "That scar," Cale said carefully, keeping his voice gentle, despite the storm raging inside him, "came from the night you were taken. Not from a childhood fall. I was there. I watched a healer close that wound myself." Gasps rippled through the crowd again, louder this time, as guests began whispering urgently to one another, some rising from their seats entirely to get a clearer view of the unfolding scene. The priest, uncertain of his role in a ceremony that had clearly derailed beyond his control, took a cautious step back from the platform, his prayer book still open but forgotten in his hands. Ronan's composure cracked further, a flash of something dangerous crossing his features, before he forced it back beneath a mask of concern. "This is absurd," he said, turning to address the crowd rather than Cale directly, his voice pitched to carry across the hall. "The Alpha King has clearly lost his senses, making wild claims to disrupt a lawful union. Guards, please escort him out, so we may continue the ceremony in peace." Several armed men near the edges of the hall shifted uncertainly, glancing between Ronan and Cale, unsure whose authority held greater weight in this moment. None of them moved immediately, sensing that acting against the Alpha King of the Northern Pax, even at another lord's request, could carry consequences far beyond a single interrupted wedding. Illyra, watching the tension ripple through the room, felt something shift inside her, a small but undeniable spark of clarity breaking through the fog that had clouded her thoughts since childhood. She had always been told her memories before the age of 16 were lost due to an accident, a fall from a cliff near the river, that left her with no recollection of her early life. Her adoptive parents, Edmund and Clara Hale, had raised her with love and care after finding her wandering the forest, injured and disoriented, unable to say her own name. She had built her entire identity around that story, around the gentle family who took her in and gave her a new life. But standing here now, feeling the pull of a bond she could not explain, and staring into eyes that seemed to know her better than she knew herself, she wondered for the first time if the story she had been told was the whole truth. "Wait," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with unexpected firmness. Ronan turned to her, surprise flickering across his face at the interruption. "I want to hear what he has to say." "Illyra, please," Ronan said, his tone shifting from urgency to something closer to pleading. "This is our wedding day. Whatever he claims, we can discuss it later, privately, once the ceremony is complete. Do not let a stranger's confusion ruin what we have built together." But Illyra shook her head slowly, stepping back from him just slightly, enough to create distance between them that had not existed a few minutes earlier. "If what he says is true," she said, "then I deserve to know before I make a promise I cannot take back. And if it is not true, then there is no harm in hearing him out." The crowd fell into a hush again, watching the bride's quiet defiance with a mixture of shock and fascination. Nora Bellwether, Illyra's closest friend and maid of honor, stood just behind her, her earlier nervousness now sharpening into something closer to alarm. She had been uneasy about this wedding from the very beginning, though she had never been able to articulate exactly why. Watching the scene unfold now, she found herself silently hoping that whatever truth was about to surface would finally explain the unease that had followed her for months. Cale took the opening Alira had given him, choosing his next words carefully, aware that everything depended on how the next few minutes unfolded. 5 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion beneath it. You were part of my pack, living near the northern border. You and I shared a bond that few wolves are fortunate enough to find, a connection that told us we belonged to each other before either of us fully understood what that meant. One night, during a routine patrol, our group was attacked by rogue fighters. In the chaos, you were separated from the rest of us. We searched for weeks. We found evidence of a struggle, but no trace of where you had gone. Eventually, we were forced to accept that you were likely dead. Alira listened, her breathing shallow, her mind racing to reconcile the story with the only childhood she had ever known. That's not possible, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she wanted it to carry. I grew up in the village by the river. My parents found me after I fell from the cliffs near our home. I have no memory of any pack, any attack, any of what you're describing. Because someone erased those memories, Cale said quietly, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ronan before returning to her face. I don't yet know exactly how, but I believe your lost memories and your sudden appearance in a village far from where you vanished are not a coincidence. Ronan's jaw tightened visibly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed unable to find the smooth words that had carried him through every previous exchange. You have no proof of any of this, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. You are building a story out of a scar and a feeling, nothing more. Then explain why you fled the kingdom the same season she disappeared, Cale said, his tone sharpening into something colder, more commanding, the voice of a king rather than a grieving mate. Explain why, after 5 years of silence, you resurface with a woman who matches every detail of my missing mate, planning to marry her before anyone from my pack could ever cross paths with her again. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, shifting now from confusion to something closer to suspicion, directed at the groom rather than the uninvited king. Ronan's eyes darted toward the exits, calculating, and Cale recognized the look immediately, the subtle shift of weight onto the balls of his feet, the flicker of a man preparing to run rather than face the consequences of questions he could not answer. I did not do anything wrong, Ronan said, though the words came out too quickly, too defensively, lacking the calm authority he had carried just minutes earlier. I found her wandering, injured and lost, and I helped her rebuild a life. That is not a crime. That is compassion. Then why lie about how you met her? Alira asked suddenly, her voice sharp with a dawning realization that cut through the last of her hesitation. You told me we met at a market fair in the eastern towns, 3 years ago. Not that you found me wandering injured. Which story is true, Ronan? The question landed like a physical blow, and Ronan's composure finally shattered entirely. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly aware that any explanation he offered now would only deepen the suspicion surrounding him. Guests who had once smiled warmly at the handsome groom now watched him with narrowed eyes, sensing that the fairy tale wedding they had gathered to witness was unraveling into something far darker. Nora stepped forward then, placing a steadying hand on Alira's shoulder, her expression a mixture of protectiveness and quiet vindication. I always wondered about the gaps in his stories, she murmured, just loud enough for Alira to hear. I should have said something sooner. Alira turned to look at Cale again, searching his face for any sign of deceit, any hint that this entire confrontation might be an elaborate manipulation rather than a rescue from one. But all she found in his golden eyes was a raw, unguarded hope, the kind of vulnerability a man like him, a king who commanded armies and ruled vast lands, rarely allowed anyone to see. It did not feel like a performance. It felt like truth laid bare. I don't remember you, she said softly, and she watched something in his expression flicker with pain before he carefully hid it away. But I feel something when I look at you that I have never felt with anyone else, including the man I was about to marry. I don't know what that means yet, but I know I cannot walk forward into these vows without understanding it first. The priest, sensing that the ceremony had reached an impossible impasse, quietly closed his prayer book and stepped back further, silently acknowledging that whatever was happening now had moved far beyond his role to guide. Ronan, realizing that the crowd's sympathy and the bride's trust were both slipping irretrievably from his grasp, took a step back from the platform, his eyes scanning the hall one final time. "This is not over," he said, his voice low, meant only for Cale and Alira to hear clearly, though several guests nearby caught the words as well. "You do not know what you are walking back into, Alira. Everything I have built for you, everything I offered, none of it compares to what waits for you in his world." Before anyone could respond, before Cale could close the distance between them and demand answers, Ronan turned and moved swiftly toward a side door near the platform, disappearing through it, before any of the uncertain guards could decide whether stopping him was within their authority. Shouts rose from the crowd as several guests surged toward the exits to see where he had gone, while others remained frozen, still processing the collapse of the wedding they had come to celebrate. Cale's instinct was to pursue him immediately, to hunt down his half-brother, and demand the truth through whatever means necessary. But as he turned toward the door Ronan had vanished through, a soft, trembling hand caught his sleeve, stopping him in place. "Please," Alira said, her voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence she had shown moments before, revealing the fear and confusion beneath it. "Before you go anywhere, before anything else happens, I need you to explain everything. All of it. I need to understand who I really am." Cale looked down at her hand on his sleeve, at the delicate fingers that once, 5 years ago, had intertwined with his own, during quiet nights beneath northern stars. Neither of them had ever expected to share again. The pull to chase Ronan warred fiercely with the desperate need to stay beside the woman he had mourned for half a decade, now standing close enough to touch, asking him for the truth he had waited years to give her. He made his choice in an instant, turning fully toward her, letting Ronan disappear into the chaos of fleeing guests and confused guards. Whatever his brother had planned, whatever lies had built the last 5 years of Alira's stolen life, none of it mattered more than the woman standing in front of him, finally awake to a truth that had been buried far too long. "Come with me," he said softly, extending his hand toward her, palm open, patient, leaving the choice entirely hers, despite every instinct screaming at him, to simply pull her close and never let go again. "Let me tell you everything." For a long, breathless moment, Alira stared at his outstretched hand, at the calloused fingers of a king who had clearly spent as much time fighting battles as sitting upon a throne. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, a warmth spread through her chest, unlike anything she had ever felt before, chasing away the last remnants of doubt clouding her mind. Whatever truth waited for her beyond the walls of this shattered wedding, she was finally ready to face it. Cale led Alira away from the chaos of the hall, through a quieter corridor, lined with tall windows that let in the soft gold light of late afternoon. Behind them, the sounds of confused guests and shouting guards slowly faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of their footsteps against polished stone. Nora followed close behind, refusing to let her friend walk into an unknown situation without someone she trusted nearby, and Cale made no attempt to stop her, sensing that Alira would need a familiar face as the truth unfolded. They reached a private study near the edge of the estate, a quiet room with tall bookshelves and a fireplace that crackled softly despite the mild weather outside. A tall man, with sharp eyes and a calm, watchful presence, stood near the window, clearly waiting for news of what had happened at the ceremony. His expression shifted from concern to something closer to disbelief the moment he saw who walked through the door behind Cale. "This is Finn," Cale said, gesturing toward the man by the window. "My beta and closest advisor. He was there the night you disappeared. He searched for you longer than anyone, myself included." Finn stepped forward slowly, studying Alira's face with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably under his gaze. "It really is you," he murmured, shaking his head slightly, as though trying to convince himself the sight before him was real. "We looked everywhere, for months. I never believed the reports that called off the search, not fully." Alira lowered herself into a chair, near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap, feeling suddenly very small, in a room full of people who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. "I need someone to start from the beginning," she said quietly. "Please, all of it." Kale took a seat across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched, though he kept a respectful distance, allowing her space to process everything without feeling crowded. Nora settled into a chair near the door, silent but attentive, while Finn remained standing, his arms crossed, ready to fill in details Kale might overlook in his own emotional retelling. 5 years ago, Kale began, you lived among my pack near the northern border. You had only recently discovered your connection to our world, having been raised for most of your childhood, believing you were fully human, unaware of the wolf blood running through your family line. When you came of age and your abilities began to surface, our paths crossed during a gathering of northern clans. The moment I saw you, I felt the pull of the mate bond, stronger than anything I had ever experienced, and from the look on your face that day, I believe you felt it too. Elira's fingers tightened in her lap, an unfamiliar ache blooming in her chest as she listened, as though some buried part of her recognized the shape of the story, even if she could not recall the details themselves. Go on, she whispered. We spent months getting to know each other, Kale continued, his voice softening with the memory. You were cautious at first, understandably overwhelmed by a world you had only just discovered. But slowly, you began to trust me, to trust this life. We were planning to formalize our bond, to hold a ceremony that would join us permanently, when the attack happened. Finn stepped closer, his expression darkening. It was during a routine patrol along the eastern border, he said. A group of rogue fighters ambushed our party. At the time, we assumed it was simply an act of aggression from an unaligned pack looking to test our defenses. But looking back now, knowing what we know about Ronan's reappearance, I believe the attack was staged specifically to separate Elira from the rest of us. I don't understand, Elira said, shaking her head slowly. If Ronan is truly connected to this attack, what would he gain from taking me? Why would anyone go through such lengths? Kale's jaw tightened, old anger resurfacing alongside the grief he had carried for years. Ronan is my half-brother, he explained. We share the same father but different mothers. Growing up, there was always tension between us, fueled by his belief that he deserved the throne more than I did, despite the laws of succession favoring me as the firstborn son. Years ago, before your disappearance, I discovered evidence that he had been quietly building alliances with rival packs, positioning himself to challenge my rule. When I confronted him, he denied everything, but the evidence was undeniable. I exiled him from the kingdom rather than pursuing harsher punishment, largely out of respect for the memory of our father. And you believe he arranged the attack to take me specifically, Elira said slowly, piecing the logic together even as her mind rebelled against the implications. Because taking your fated mate would weaken you. Because a broken bond leaves an alpha vulnerable, distracted by grief rather than focused on ruling. That is my theory, Kale said, though until this afternoon, I had no way to prove it. I assumed you were dead, killed in the attack, your body lost to the wilderness before we could recover it. I never imagined he had taken you alive, erased your memories somehow, and rebuilt your entire identity, in a village far from anywhere our search parties ever thought to look. Elira pressed her palms against her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of a stolen life she was only now beginning to understand. My parents, she said softly. Edmund and Clara, they raised me with such kindness. Are you telling me they were involved in this as well? Finn shook his head gently. Not necessarily, he said. It's possible they were simply good people who found an injured young woman and took her in, entirely unaware of the larger scheme surrounding her arrival. Ronan is clever enough to have arranged your placement without involving anyone who might ask too many questions. The thought offered Elira a small measure of comfort, though it did little to settle the storm of confusion still raging inside her. She thought of her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair each morning, of her father's patient lessons teaching her to read by candlelight, of every ordinary, loving moment that had shaped the person she believed herself to be. None of it had been a lie, even if the circumstances surrounding her arrival into that family had been engineered by someone with far darker intentions. There's something else, Nora said suddenly, breaking her silence for the first time since they had entered the study. All eyes turned toward her, and she shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention before continuing. A few months ago, before Ronan proposed, I found a letter in his study. I wasn't looking for it deliberately, I promise. I was simply helping him organize some papers for a business matter. But the letter mentioned something about a debt owed to him by a healer from the Western Territories, Someone he referred to only by initials. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But now, hearing all of this, I wonder if that healer was involved in whatever was done to erase your memories. Cale's eyes sharpened with renewed purpose. Do you remember anything else about the letter? A name, a location, anything that might help us track down this healer? Nora frowned, trying to recall the details more clearly. I believe the letter mentioned a village near the southern hills, somewhere close to the old ruins by the river crossing. I can try to remember more if given time, but I did not think to memorize every detail at the moment. That's more than we had an hour ago, Finn said, already moving towards the door, his mind clearly shifting into strategic planning. I'll send scouts to the southern hills immediately. If this healer exists and is responsible for altering Alira's memories, finding them could help reverse whatever was done, or at least confirm the truth of what happened that night. As Finn moved toward the door to issue orders, Alira suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her temple, as a sharp, sudden pain lanced through her skull. Cale was at her side instantly, kneeling beside her chair, his hands hovering uncertainly, unsure whether to touch her or give her space. Alira, what's wrong? He asked urgently, his voice tight with concern. She squeezed her eyes shut, gritting her teeth against the pain, and in the darkness behind her closed eyelids, fragmented images began to surface, disjointed and chaotic, like pieces of a shattered mirror, reflecting a scene she could not fully see. Trees rushing past in a blur, the sound of snarling and shouting. A hand gripping her arm so tightly it left bruises. A voice, cold and familiar, telling her to be quiet, that everything would be easier if she simply cooperated. I see trees, she gasped, her voice trembling. Running. Someone is chasing me, or I'm running from something. There's shouting, fighting sounds. And a voice, telling me to stay quiet, that this would all be easier if I just listened. Cale's hands finally settled gently on her shoulders, steadying her, as the fragmented memory continued to unfold behind her closed eyes. That's it, he said softly, his voice a careful balance of urgency and comfort. That's the night of the attack. Stay with it if you can, but don't force it. Let it come naturally. The image sharpened slightly, and Alira saw, for just a fleeting instant, a face leaning close to hers, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist with sudden nausea. It was Ronan's face, younger, harder, his eyes cold in a way she had never witnessed during their years together. You'll thank me eventually, the memory of his voice whispered. This is for your own protection. Her eyes snapped open, and she stared at Cale with an expression of dawning horror. It was him, she whispered. And Ronan was there that night. He's the one who took me. The room fell into heavy silence, as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Cale's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, the calm, controlled king giving way briefly to the wolf beneath, eyes flashing gold with barely restrained fury. Finn's hand tightened around the door handle, his earlier plan to send scouts, now accompanied by a far more urgent need, to hunt down the man who had orchestrated 5 years of deception and stolen a woman's entire identity. We need to find him, Cale said, his voice low and dangerously steady, the calm before a storm neither Ronan nor anyone aligned with him would want to face, before he disappears again, and we lose another 5 years searching for the truth. Alira, still shaking from the fractured memory, reached out and caught Cale's arm before he could rise to give the order himself. Wait, she said, her voice steadier now, strengthened by the anger beginning to replace her earlier fear. If I go with you, if I help however I can, we might learn more than any scout could find alone. My memories are returning. There might be more hidden inside me, details that could help us understand exactly what he did and why. Cale studied her for a long moment, torn between the protective instinct urging him to keep her far from danger and the recognition that she deserved a voice in decisions concerning her own stolen past. Finally, he nodded slowly. We do this together then, he said, but I will not let you walk into danger unprotected. Whatever Ronan has planned next, we face it as a team. Nora rose from her seat, her expression fierce with newfound determination. Then I'm coming too, she said firmly. Alira is my closest friend, and I refuse to sit safely in a study while she walks toward whatever danger Ronan has planned. Besides, I might remember more details from that letter, if given the chance to think it through properly. Finn allowed himself a small, tired smile at the resolve filling the room, a stark contrast to the shock and confusion that had dominated the earlier hours. "Then let's move quickly," he said. "The longer we wait, the further Ronan gets, and the colder any remaining trail becomes." As the group began organizing their plans, gathering supplies and mapping the fastest routes toward the southern hills, Elira found herself staring at Cale from across the room, watching the quiet intensity with which he issued instructions to his advisors and guards. Despite the chaos of the day, despite the shattered wedding, and the fractured memories still surfacing painfully in her mind, she felt something steady begin to take root inside her. A growing certainty that whatever truth waited at the end of this search, she would face it with the strength of a man who had never truly stopped believing she was alive, waiting somewhere to be found. The sun outside had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and rose, and as Cale finally turned back to meet her gaze across the room, Elira understood with sudden clarity that whatever life she had lived for the past 5 years, whatever name she had answered to, and whatever family had raised her with love, none of it changed the undeniable truth pulling her toward this man, and the fractured, painful history they were only just beginning to reclaim together. By nightfall, a small group had gathered at the edge of the estate grounds, ready to begin the journey toward the southern hills. Cale had chosen only a handful of trusted guards to accompany them, wary of drawing too much attention to their movements should any of Ronan's remaining allies still be watching the estate. Finn rode at the front, familiar with the winding roads that led toward the old river crossing, while Cale stayed close to Elira, who sat astride a calm gray horse borrowed from the estate stables, her earlier fear now hardened into quiet determination. Nora rode just behind them, her sharp eyes scanning the darkening tree line with unusual alertness for someone unaccustomed to traveling beyond the safety of city walls. The letter she had glimpsed months earlier weighed heavily on her mind, and she found herself replaying every detail she could recall, desperate to remember anything that might prove useful once they reached the southern hills. "Tell me about him," Elira said quietly to Cale, as they rode side by side along a narrow forest path, the horse's hooves muffled against the soft earth. "Not the king, not the alpha everyone bows to. Tell me who you were before all of this happened, before I disappeared." Cale considered the question for a long moment, the request catching him slightly off guard. Few people asked him about the man beneath the title, and fewer still had the right to expect an honest answer. But something about the quiet vulnerability in Elira's voice made him want to offer her every truth he possessed. "I was different before I met you," he admitted. "Harder, perhaps. My father died when I was young, forcing me to take on responsibilities most men my age never have to consider. I built walls around myself early, believing that a king could not afford the luxury of softness. Then I met you, and for the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to simply exist, without the weight of a crown pressing down on every decision." Elira listened quietly, absorbing his words with a strange mixture of comfort and grief, for a connection she could not fully remember, but somehow still felt the absence of. "I wish I could remember what that felt like," she said softly, "being known by someone so completely." "You will," Cale said, his voice gentle but certain. "Memories buried are not memories destroyed. Whatever was done to you, I believe it can be undone, especially now that pieces are already beginning to surface." Their conversation was interrupted by Finn slowing his horse ahead of them, raising a hand to signal caution. The group came to a stop at the edge of a small clearing, where the remains of a campfire still smoldered faintly, suggesting recent activity. Finn dismounted carefully, crouching beside the ashes to examine them more closely. "This fire was extinguished within the last hour," he said quietly, glancing around the surrounding trees with heightened alertness. "Someone was here recently, and given the direction we're traveling, I doubt it's a coincidence." Cale dismounted as well, motioning for the guards to spread out cautiously around the clearing, while keeping Elira and Nora close to the center, where they could be better protected. The forest around them had gone unusually silent, the typical evening sounds of birds and insects noticeably absent, a detail that raised the hair on the back of Cale's neck with instinctive warning. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing, and instantly, the guards tensed, hands moving toward weapons secured at their sides. Cale positioned himself protectively in front of Elira, his eyes scanning the tree line with sharp, focused intensity, his wolf senses stretching outward to detect any hidden threat. Show yourselves, he called out firmly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. Whoever you are, know that you stand before the Alpha King of the Northern Pax, and any hostile action taken here will not go unanswered. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, figures began emerging from the shadows between the trees, at least 6 armed individuals, dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, designed for stealth rather than formal combat. At their front stood a woman, with sharp features and calculating eyes, her posture radiating a confidence that suggested she was accustomed to commanding those around her. Selene, Finn muttered under his breath, recognition flashing across his face. I should have known Ronan wouldn't run without arranging backup. The woman smiled thinly, unbothered by the recognition. Finn Callahan, she said, her voice smooth and controlled. It has been a long time. I see you're still playing loyal advisor to a king who let his own brother slip through his fingers this afternoon. Where is Ronan? Cale demanded, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries or delay. I have no interest in exchanging insults with you, Selene. Tell me where he's hiding, and perhaps this confrontation can end without unnecessary bloodshed. Selene's smile widened slightly, though it did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. Ronan is exactly where he needs to be, she said, preparing for whatever comes next. My role here is simply to ensure you don't reach the southern hills before he's ready for your arrival. Alira's breath caught at the confirmation that their destination had somehow already been anticipated, that every step of their journey was being watched and accounted for by people working alongside Ronan. You knew we would come here, she said, stepping slightly out from behind Cale despite his instinctive attempt to keep her shielded. You knew about the healer. Of course, Selene said, turning her attention toward Alira with an expression that mixed curiosity and something almost like pity. I was there the night your memories were altered, dear girl. I watched the entire process. It's remarkable, honestly, how thoroughly a mind can be reshaped when the right methods are applied with patience and precision. The casual cruelty in her words sent a chill through the clearing, and Alira felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, anger beginning to overtake the fear that had gripped her only moments before. Then you'll understand exactly why I need answers, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. And why nothing you or Ronan do tonight will stop me from getting them. Selene studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind her calculating gaze, before she turned back to address Cale directly. Your mate has spirit, she said. Ronan always said she would eventually, once the right pressure was applied. It's a shame he won't be here to see it firsthand. Enough, Cale said sharply, his patience finally reaching its limit. Either stand aside and let us pass, or face the consequences of standing against the Northern Pax. I will not ask again. For a moment, tension hung thick in the air, the armed figures behind Selene shifting slightly, awaiting her signal. Then, unexpectedly, Selene raised a hand, gesturing for her group to lower their weapons slightly, though the wariness in their stances remained unchanged. I have no interest in dying for Ronan's ambitions tonight, she said, her tone shifting into something more pragmatic, almost businesslike. My involvement in this began as a transaction, nothing more. I altered the girl's memories because I was paid generously to do so, not out of any personal loyalty to your brother's cause. If you wish to pass, I will allow it, on one condition. Name it, Cale said, though caution remained sharp in his voice. Leave me a clear path to disappear once this confrontation ends, Selene said. I have no desire to spend the remainder of my life as a prisoner in your dungeons, answering endless questions about spell work better left forgotten. Grant me safe passage away from this conflict, and I will tell you everything I know about what was done to her, and where Ronan intends to go next. Cale glanced briefly at Alira, silently seeking her input on a decision that affected her more directly than anyone else present. Alira gave a small, resolute nod, understanding instinctively that answers mattered more in this moment than punishment for a woman who, however involved in the scheme, was clearly not its primary architect. You have my word, Cale said finally. Safe passage, in exchange for full honesty. But know that if you lie to us, or if this is some trap designed to delay us further, there will be nowhere in this kingdom, or beyond it, where you can hide from my pursuit. Selene inclined her head slightly, accepting the terms. A fair arrangement, she said. Very well. 5 years ago, Ronan approached me with a proposition. He needed someone skilled in memory manipulation to erase a young woman's identity and rebuild her past, convincingly enough that she would never question it. The attack on your patrol was staged specifically to create the opportunity for her capture without raising immediate suspicion toward him. And the memory alteration itself? Illyra asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. How exactly was it done? Through a combination of herbal compounds and a specific type of binding ritual, Selene explained. It suppresses specific memories while allowing the rest of the mind to function normally, creating the illusion of a complete, unbroken identity, built around a false history. The process is not permanent, however. Strong emotional triggers, particularly ones connected to the suppressed memories themselves, can begin breaking down the binding over time, which explains why you're already recovering fragments after simply encountering Kale again. Illyra absorbed this information carefully, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anger settle over her. Relief, because it meant her true memories were not lost forever, merely hidden beneath layers of careful manipulation. Anger, because someone had deliberately stolen years of her life and identity for the sake of political ambition. Where is Ronan headed now? Finn asked, stepping forward to press the conversation toward more immediate strategic concerns. Selene's expression grew slightly more guarded. He mentioned an old fortress near the Western Cliffs, abandoned decades ago, but still structurally sound enough to serve as a temporary stronghold. He has allies gathering there, though I do not know the full scope of his forces or his exact intentions, beyond regrouping and reassessing his options, now that his plan has unraveled. Kale's expression hardened at the mention of gathering allies, understanding immediately that whatever Ronan intended next would likely involve more than simply fleeing into hiding. A man desperate enough to stage an elaborate deception spanning 5 years would not surrender easily, now that his scheme had been exposed. "Thank you," Kale said finally, his tone carefully measured despite the urgency building within him. "You've kept your end of the bargain. Go now, before I reconsider the terms of our agreement." Selene offered a final, unreadable glance toward Illyra before turning and disappearing back into the darkness of the forest, her armed companions following silently behind her. The clearing fell quiet once again, the tension of the confrontation slowly dissolving into the cool night air. "The Western Cliffs," Finn said, already calculating the fastest route in his mind. "It will take us the better part of 2 days to reach them by horseback, longer if the weather turns against us." "Then we leave at first light," Kale said, turning to address the group. "Tonight we rest, and Illyra, we give you time to process everything you've learned. Tomorrow, we finish what was interrupted 5 years ago." Illyra nodded slowly, exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with the overwhelming events of the day. As the group began setting up a temporary camp within the relative safety of the clearing, she found herself standing quietly beside Kale, staring up at the stars beginning to emerge across the darkening sky. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for not giving up on finding the truth, even when everyone told you I was gone." Kale turned to look at her, the firelight from the newly rekindled campfire casting warm shadows across his face. "I never truly gave up," he admitted quietly. "Not really. Some part of me always knew you were still out there, waiting to be found. I just didn't know how to reach you until today." As the fire crackled softly beside them, and the rest of the group settled into an uneasy but necessary rest, Illyra allowed herself, for the first time since the collapsed wedding, to simply exist in the quiet comfort of his presence, trusting that whatever awaited them at the Western Cliffs, she would face it with the truth finally beginning to reclaim its rightful place in her mind. Sleep came slowly to Illyra that night, her mind too crowded with fragmented memories and unanswered questions to settle easily into rest. She lay near the fire, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest and the occasional low murmur of guards keeping watch at the edges of the camp. Across the fire, Kale sat awake as well, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, clearly unwilling to fully rest while potential threats might still be lurking nearby. "You should sleep," Illyra said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "We have a long journey ahead." "I will," Kale replied, though he made no move to lie down. "Old habits. I've spent too many nights on patrol to fully trust the quiet of a forest camp, even with guards posted." Illyra propped herself up slightly, studying him across the flickering firelight. "Tell me how we met," she said softly. The real story, not the fragments I'm piecing together on my own. Cale's expression softened at the request, old memories rising to the surface with a mixture of warmth and lingering grief. It was during a gathering of the northern clans, he began. You had come with a small group, representing a distant branch of wolves, who had lived largely apart from pack structures, more isolated, more independent. You didn't know the customs, didn't bow when you were supposed to, and accidentally insulted 3 separate nobles within your first hour at the gathering. A small, surprised laugh escaped Alira, despite the heaviness of the conversation. That sounds like something I would do, she admitted. Even now, without the memories, that feels true. You were unapologetic about it too, Cale continued, a fond smile tugging at his lips. When one of the nobles complained to me directly, expecting me to reprimand you, you simply looked him in the eye and said that customs meant to make people feel small were not customs worth following. I had never seen anyone speak so boldly to a member of my court, let alone a woman who had only just arrived. What happened then? Alira asked, leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious despite the strangeness of hearing her own history recounted like a story about someone else. I found myself unable to stop watching you for the rest of the evening, Cale admitted, which, given my position, drew far more attention than I intended. By the end of the gathering, half the court believed I had lost my mind, entertaining an unknown wolf with no formal pack ties or noble lineage. But the moment I finally spoke with you directly, the moment our hands touched during a formal introduction neither of us wanted to have, I felt the bond settle into place, undeniable and immediate. Alira touched her chest unconsciously, the same warmth she had felt at the wedding stirring faintly again at his words. Did I feel it too? She asked. In that moment? You did, Cale said softly, though you fought against it far more stubbornly than I did. You spent the following weeks insisting the connection was simply coincidence, or some trick of instinct rather than fate. It took nearly 2 months before you finally admitted you felt exactly what I felt, and even longer before you agreed to formally consider a future together. I sound stubborn, Alira said, a small smile finally breaking through the exhaustion and confusion weighing on her. You were, Cale confirmed, his voice warm with affection. You still are, apparently, given how quickly you challenged Ronan in front of an entire hall of wedding guests. The mention of Ronan sobered the conversation slightly, and Alira's smile faded as more serious thoughts crept back in. Do you think my parents, Edmund and Clara, knew any of this? She asked. Or do you think they were simply innocent people, caught up in someone else's scheme? I don't know, Cale admitted honestly. But regardless of what we discover, the love they gave you over these past 5 years was likely real, even if the circumstances surrounding your arrival were built on deception. That's not something anyone can take away from you, whatever else we uncover. Alira nodded slowly, comforted somewhat by his words, though the uncertainty surrounding her adoptive family continued to weigh heavily on her mind. She thought of sending word to them, explaining even a fraction of what had happened, but the timing felt impossible given the urgency of reaching the western cliffs before Ronan could regroup and strengthen his position further. As if sensing her thoughts, Nora spoke quietly from her spot near the fire, having apparently been awake and listening throughout much of the conversation. I can send word to your parents once we reach the next town, she offered. A simple message, enough to let them know you're safe, without revealing details that might put them at risk if Ronan's allies are watching them. Thank you, Alira said gratefully, relieved that at least this small worry could be addressed without further delay. The following morning, the group broke camp at first light, continuing their journey toward the western cliffs with renewed urgency. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, forests giving way to rocky hills and narrow mountain paths that demanded careful navigation. Finn rode ahead, scouting for signs of danger, while Cale remained close to Alira, both watchful and quietly attentive to her well-being, as more fragmented memories continued surfacing throughout the journey. By midday, they reached a small village, nestled at the base of the mountains, a modest collection of homes and shops that offered a brief opportunity to rest the horses and gather supplies before continuing into more treacherous terrain. Nora used the stop to send word to Edmund and Clara Hale, crafting a careful message that reassured them of Alira's safety, without revealing the full complexity of the situation unfolding. While the group rested, Alira wandered toward the edge of the village, drawn by an unfamiliar pull she couldn't quite explain. Kale followed a short distance behind, giving her space while remaining close enough to intervene should any danger arise. She stopped near a small stream running along the village's edge, staring down at the clear water with an expression of quiet concentration. "Something feels familiar here," she said softly, more to herself than to Kale, though she knew he was listening. "I don't know why. I've never been to this village before, not that I remember." "Perhaps it reminds you of somewhere else," Kale offered gently, stepping up beside her. Memories don't always return as clear images. Sometimes they surface as feelings first, echoes of places and moments the mind isn't ready to fully reconstruct yet. Alira nodded slowly, watching the water ripple gently over smooth stones. "There was a stream," she said suddenly, another fragment surfacing unexpectedly. "Near your territory. We used to sit beside it in the evenings, didn't we?" Kale's breath caught slightly at the memory she had just described, one he hadn't mentioned during their conversation the previous night. "Yes," he said quietly, wonder coloring his voice. "We did. It was one of the first places we spent time together outside of formal gatherings." Tears welled unexpectedly in Alira's eyes, the emotional weight of reclaiming even small pieces of her stolen past, finally breaking through the composed strength she had maintained throughout the journey. Kale, sensing her distress, reached out carefully, offering comfort without overwhelming her, and when she leaned into his side, accepting the support, he wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, holding her close, as the quiet grief of 5 lost years finally found room to surface. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for not remembering sooner, for standing at that altar, about to marry someone else, without any idea of what I was truly walking away from." "You have nothing to apologize for," Kale said firmly, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly affecting him as well. "None of this was your fault. You were a victim of a scheme designed specifically to keep you from ever remembering the truth. The only person who owes an apology in this situation is Ronan, and he will answer for everything he's done, I promise you that." They stood together beside the stream for several long minutes, the quiet comfort of shared grief and cautious hope settling between them, before Finn approached to signal that the horses were rested and ready to continue their journey. Reluctantly, Alira stepped back from Kale's embrace, wiping the last of her tears away, as she steeled herself for the remainder of the difficult path ahead. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as the afternoon wore on, the mountain paths narrowing and steepening as they climbed toward the higher elevations that would eventually lead them to the western cliffs. Finn called for periodic stops to rest the horses, using the pauses to scout ahead for any signs of danger or ambush that might threaten their approach. During one such stop, as the group paused near a rocky outcropping overlooking a wide valley below, Nora suddenly called out sharply, pointing toward movement visible in the distance. Kale followed her gesture, his sharp eyes immediately identifying a group of riders moving swiftly along a parallel path, clearly tracking a route that would eventually intersect with their own. "How many?" Kale asked, already moving toward his horse. "I count at least 8, Finn confirmed, having pulled out a small spyglass to examine the distant riders more closely. "Moving with purpose, not simply traveling. I'd wager good coin they're aware of our position, and closing the distance deliberately." "Ronan's men," Alira said, her voice tight with tension as she recalled Celine's earlier warning about allies gathering at the western fortress. "He knew we would come. He's sending forces to intercept us before we even reach the cliffs." Kale's expression hardened into the calm, calculating focus of a seasoned commander assessing a battlefield. "We have the higher ground here," he said, studying the terrain around them. "If they intend to intercept us, better to face them on ground of our choosing than to be caught exposed on an open path." Finn nodded in agreement, already directing the guards to take defensive positions among the rocky outcroppings surrounding their resting point. "The path narrows significantly, about a quarter-mile ahead," he added. "If we can hold them here, we limit how many can engage us at once." Alira felt fear tighten in her chest, not for herself alone, but for the small group who had risked so much to help her uncover the truth of her stolen past. She thought of Nora, who had no formal combat training, and felt a fierce protective instinct rise within her. Foreign, yet undeniably present, a small hint perhaps of the wolf blood that ran through her own veins despite years of living entirely unaware of its existence. "What can I do to help?" she asked Kale, refusing to simply stand aside while others risked their safety on her behalf. Kale studied her for a moment, clearly weighing the desire to protect her against the recognition that she deserved agency in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Stay close to Nora," he said finally, "behind the guards, but ready to move quickly if the situation shifts. Your safety remains the priority, but I won't insult you by asking you to simply hide and hope for the best." Elira nodded, accepting the compromise, and moved to position herself near Nora as the guards finished arranging their defensive formation among the rocks. The distant riders continued their approach, growing steadily larger and more distinct as the gap between the two groups narrowed with each passing minute. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the surrounding rock formations, Kale drew his sword calmly, his expression settling into the focused calm of a man who had faced far worse odds throughout years of defending his kingdom. Beside him, Finn readied his own weapon, while the guards around them tensed in anticipation of the confrontation about to unfold. "Whatever happens," Kale said quietly, glancing briefly toward Elira before turning his full attention back toward the approaching threat, "know that I will not let anyone take you from me again. Not Ronan, not his allies, not anyone." Elira held his gaze for a brief, steadying moment, drawing strength from the fierce determination reflected in his golden eyes, before the first of the approaching riders came into full view around the bend of the mountain path, and the quiet tension of the afternoon shattered into the sharp, urgent reality of a confrontation neither side seemed willing to avoid. The riders slowed as they rounded the bend, clearly registering the defensive formation Kale's group had arranged among the rocks. For a tense moment, both sides simply studied one another across the narrowing distance, neither willing to make the first move. Then a man at the front of the approaching group, broad-shouldered and clearly accustomed to command, raised a hand to bring his riders to a full stop. "Alpha King Kale Draven," the man called out, his tone carrying more caution than outright hostility. "We were not sent to engage in conflict. Lord Ronan instructed us only to observe your movements and report back." Kale's eyes narrowed with suspicion, unwilling to lower his guard based on words alone. "Observation rarely requires 8 armed riders moving with such urgency," he replied, his voice carrying clearly across the rocky terrain. "Forgive me if I remain cautious of your true intentions." The lead rider glanced briefly at his companions before returning his attention to Kale, something uncertain flickering across his expression. "With respect, my lord, many of us were given only partial information about this assignment. We were told to track your group and report your position, nothing more. If there is more to Lord Ronan's plans than we were informed, that is not knowledge we currently possess." Finn stepped forward slightly, his sharp eyes studying the riders with careful assessment. "You said you were instructed to report our position," he said. "Report it to whom, and for what purpose?" The lead rider hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of answering honestly against whatever loyalty he still held toward Ronan. Finally he spoke, his voice lower now, more guarded. "To the fortress at the western cliffs," he admitted. "Lord Ronan is gathering forces there, preparing defenses. He anticipated you would eventually track his movements and wished to have advance warning of your approach." Elira, watching from her position near Nora, felt a chill settle over her at the confirmation that Ronan was actively preparing for confrontation, rather than simply fleeing to safety. "How many forces has he gathered?" she asked, stepping forward slightly despite Kale's earlier instruction to remain protected among the guards. The rider's eyes shifted toward her, clearly recognizing her as the woman at the center of the unfolding conflict. "Perhaps 30, my lady," he said. "Though not all are fighters in the traditional sense, some are simply loyal servants and allies who followed him into exile years ago, uncertain of what role they might play should conflict actually arise." Kale absorbed this information carefully, recalculating the risks of their approach toward the fortress. 30 forces, even if not all combat trained, still represented a significant obstacle compared to the small group currently traveling with him. "And you," he said, addressing the lead rider directly, "where does your loyalty truly lie in this matter?" The man considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I served under Lord Ronan, out of necessity, not devotion," he admitted. "Many of us who followed him into exile did so because we had few other options at the time, not because we believed deeply in his cause. If you offer fair terms, my lord, I suspect several among our group would prefer to stand aside from whatever conflict is coming, rather than risk our lives for a man who has clearly built his recent plans on lies and manipulation. Cale studied the man carefully, searching for any sign of deception, before finally nodding slowly. "Lower your weapons," he said, "and I will consider fair terms for any among you willing to stand down from this conflict. I have no interest in punishing men who were simply following orders without full knowledge of the schemes behind them." Slowly, cautiously, the riders lowered their weapons, several exchanging uncertain glances, before the lead rider dismounted, approaching Cale's position with his hands visibly empty, a clear gesture of surrender and trust. Cale's guards remained alert, but allowed the approach, sensing the genuine shift in the confrontation's tone. "My name is Callum," the man said, stopping a respectful distance from Cale. "I can offer you information about the fortress defenses, in exchange for assurance that those of us who cooperate will not face harsh punishment for our earlier association with Lord Ronan." "You have my word," Cale said, "provided the information proves accurate, and no further hostility comes from your group during our approach." Callum nodded, visibly relieved by the terms offered. "The fortress sits atop a cliff overlooking the Western Sea," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the direction they had been traveling. "Access is limited to a single narrow path along the cliff face, easily defended by even a small number of guards. Lord Ronan has stationed most of his forces along this approach, anticipating that any pursuit would need to come through that single point of entry." Finn frowned, studying the information with the careful calculation of a seasoned strategist. "Is there no alternative route?" he asked. "Attacking directly into a heavily defended choke point seems unwise, particularly given our limited numbers." Callum hesitated for a moment before answering. "There is a smaller path," he admitted, "used historically for supply deliveries before the fortress fell into disrepair. It winds around the base of the cliff, more difficult to navigate but far less heavily guarded, as Lord Ronan believes few outside the fortress's original builders are aware of its existence." "And you know this path?" Cale asked, a flicker of renewed hope entering his tone. "I do," Callum confirmed. "I explored much of the fortress and its surroundings during my time serving Lord Ronan, largely out of boredom, during the quieter periods of our exile. I can guide you there, if you're willing to trust my knowledge." Cale glanced toward Finn, silently seeking his advisor's assessment of the offer. Finn considered the situation for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It's a risk," he admitted, "but attacking the main approach directly carries far greater risk, particularly given our numbers. If Callum's information proves accurate, the supply path offers a far more viable option." "Very well," Cale said, turning back to address Callum directly. "Guide us to this alternate path, but know that if this proves to be a trap, if you're leading us into an ambush rather than genuine assistance, the terms of our agreement will no longer stand." "I understand," Callum said, "and I accept those terms fully." The remaining riders, seeing their leader's decision, gradually lowered their remaining hostility, several dismounting to offer additional information about the fortress's internal layout and the general disposition of Ronan's gathered forces. Illyra listened carefully throughout the exchange, absorbing every detail, aware that whatever confrontation awaited them at the fortress would likely determine not only her own future, but the stability of Cale's entire kingdom moving forward. As the group prepared to continue their journey, with Callum now guiding them toward the alternate supply path, Nora approached Illyra quietly, her expression thoughtful. "This is becoming far larger than either of us imagined when we stood at that altar yesterday," she said softly. "I know," Illyra admitted, glancing toward Cale as he finished coordinating final details with Finn and Callum. "But I don't regret asking him to speak the truth, even knowing everything that's followed. I would rather face this, whatever happens, than have continued living a life built on lies." Nora offered a small, supportive smile. "For what it's worth," she said, "watching you these past 2 days, I've seen more of your true strength than I ever witnessed during the months leading up to your wedding to Ronan. Whoever you were before your memories were taken, I think that strength was always part of who you are." The words settled comfortably over Illyra, offering a small measure of reassurance amid the ongoing uncertainty of her situation. As the group mounted their horses once more, preparing to continue the journey toward the western cliffs under Callum's guidance, she found herself glancing toward Cale, who caught her gaze and offered a brief, steady nod, silent reassurance passing between them without need for words. The remaining journey toward the fortress proved slower than their previous pace, the terrain growing increasingly treacherous as they followed Callum's guidance along paths barely wide enough for a single horse to pass safely. The sound of crashing waves grew steadily louder as they approached the western coastline, the salty scent of the sea mixing with the crisp mountain air surrounding them. By late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the group finally caught their first glimpse of the fortress in the distance, a weathered structure of gray stone perched dramatically atop towering cliffs overlooking the churning waters below. Even from this distance, Illyra could make out the silhouettes of guards patrolling the visible battlements, confirmation that Ronan's forces remained on high alert, anticipating their eventual arrival. "We'll need to wait for nightfall," Cale said quietly, studying the fortress with careful assessment. "The supply path Callum described will be difficult enough to navigate in daylight without drawing attention. Under cover of darkness, we stand a far better chance of reaching the fortress undetected." Illyra nodded, understanding the necessity of patience despite the urgency pulling at her chest, the desperate need to finally confront the man who had stolen 5 years of her life and rebuilt her entire identity around a carefully constructed lie. As the group settled into a temporary hiding spot among the rocks, waiting for darkness to fall fully over the landscape, she found herself staring toward the distant fortress, steeling herself for whatever confrontation awaited within its ancient walls. Whatever truth remained hidden inside those weathered stones, whatever final answers Ronan still held about the night her memories were stolen, she was determined to reclaim them, no matter the cost the coming hours might demand. Darkness settled fully over the coastline by the time Cale judged the moment right to move. The moon hung low and pale above the churning sea, offering just enough light to navigate without revealing their approach too clearly to any watchful guards stationed along the fortress battlements. Callum led the way along the narrow supply path, his familiarity with the terrain proving invaluable as the group carefully picked their way down a steep, winding trail cut into the cliff face itself. Illyra kept close behind Cale, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination as the fortress loomed larger with every careful step forward. Nora remained near the rear of the group, flanked protectively by 2 of the guards Cale had brought along, while Finn moved silently alongside Callum, both men scanning constantly for any sign that their approach had been detected. "There," Callum whispered eventually, gesturing toward a small, weathered door set into the base of the cliff, nearly hidden beneath overgrown vines and years of neglect. "This leads directly into the old storage cellars beneath the fortress. From there, a passage connects to the main structure, though I cannot guarantee it remains unguarded." Cale nodded, motioning for the group to proceed cautiously. Finn moved first, testing the door carefully before easing it open, the hinges groaning softly despite his careful efforts. The group slipped inside one by one, finding themselves in a dark, musty cellar filled with the remnants of long-forgotten supplies, crates and barrels covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. They moved through the cellar in tense silence, Callum guiding them toward a narrow stone staircase leading upward into the main body of the fortress. As they climbed, faint sounds began reaching them from above, muffled voices, and the occasional clatter of movement, suggesting the fortress remained active despite the late hour. At the top of the staircase, Finn raised a hand, signaling for the group to pause while he carefully checked the passage ahead. After a tense moment, he gestured for them to continue, leading them through a narrow corridor lined with flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the ancient stone walls. "Ronan's quarters are likely in the eastern tower," Callum whispered, guiding them through a series of turns that clearly reflected his familiarity with the fortress's layout. "It offers the best view of the surrounding cliffs and sea, which he always favored during his time here." They continued cautiously, avoiding 2 separate patrols of guards through careful timing and Callum's knowledge of alternate passages. Illyra's nerves grew tighter with every step, the weight of the coming confrontation settling heavily over her chest. She thought of the fragmented memories that had surfaced throughout their journey, the growing certainty of Ronan's betrayal, and steeled herself for whatever final truths awaited in the confrontation ahead. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door at the top of a spiraling staircase within the eastern tower, faint light visible beneath the gap at its base, confirming that someone remained awake within. Cale exchanged a brief glance with Finn before reaching for the door handle, his expression settling into the calm, focused resolve of a king prepared to finally confront the source of years of grief and deception. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a spacious chamber lit by several flickering candles. Ronan stood near a large window overlooking the dark, churning sea below, his back turned toward the door, though something in his posture suggested he had anticipated their arrival despite the careful stealth of their approach. "I wondered how long it would take you to find the supply path," Ronan said without turning around, his voice carrying a strange, resigned calm that caught Cale off guard. "Callum always was more resourceful than I gave him credit for." Callum shifted uncomfortably near the back of the group, though he said nothing in response to the pointed comment. Cale stepped fully into the room, positioning himself protectively near Elira, as Finn and the guards spread out cautiously along the chamber's edges. "It's over, Ronan," Cale said firmly. "Whatever you hope to accomplish through this scheme, it has unraveled entirely. Elira knows the truth now. Selene has confirmed everything. There is nowhere left for you to hide from the consequences of what you've done." Ronan finally turned to face them, and Elira was struck by how different he appeared from the composed, confident groom who had stood beside her at the altar just 2 days earlier. His eyes carried a hollow exhaustion, the mask of calm confidence he had worn for years, finally beginning to crack under the weight of his unraveling plans. "You think this was simply about ambition," Ronan said quietly, his gaze shifting toward Elira, with an expression that mixed regret and something almost like desperation. "You think I did this purely to weaken Cale's position, to claim a throne I believed should have been mine by right. But it was never that simple." "Then explain it," Elira said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning within her. "Explain why you stole 5 years of my life, erased my memories, and rebuilt my entire identity around a lie." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the dark window, before returning to meet her eyes directly. "Because I fell in love with you," he said finally, the confession startling everyone in the room into stunned silence. "Not initially, not when I first orchestrated your capture. That began purely as a calculated move against Cale, exactly as you suspect. But over the months that followed, living alongside you, watching you slowly rebuild a life within the false identity I created, I found myself genuinely caring for the woman you became, separate entirely from the political scheme that first brought us together." "That doesn't excuse what you did," Cale said sharply, stepping slightly forward, his protective instincts flaring at the confession. "Falling in love with a person you deliberately deceived does not erase the harm caused by that deception." "I know that," Ronan admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded genuinely like regret. "I have known it for years, honestly, though I buried that knowledge beneath justifications about political necessity and old grievances against my brother's rule. But watching her at the altar, watching the life we had built together, I convinced myself that perhaps the ends justified the means, that the happiness we might have found together outweighed the truth I had stolen from her to make it possible." Elira felt a complicated mixture of anger and something almost like pity stirring within her as she listened to his confession. "You didn't give me a choice," she said quietly. "Whatever happiness you believe we built together was based entirely on a lie I never consented to live. That's not love, Ronan. That's control, disguised as affection." Ronan flinched slightly at her words, the truth of them clearly landing with painful accuracy. "You're right," he admitted softly. "I understand that now, watching you stand here beside him, watching the memories return despite everything I tried to bury. I cannot undo what I've done, but I no longer wish to continue fighting a battle I have already lost." The admission caught Cale off guard, having expected far greater resistance given the elaborate scheme Ronan had constructed and defended for years. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked cautiously, wary of some final trick hidden within his brother's sudden capitulation. "I'm saying I will not fight you tonight," Ronan said, moving slowly away from the window, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. "The forces gathered here were meant as a defense against pursuit, not an offense against your kingdom. I never truly intended to engage in open conflict with you, Cale. Whatever fear or anger drove me to build these defenses in the first place." Finn remained visibly skeptical, his hand resting cautiously near his weapon, despite Ronan's apparent surrender. "Forgive me, if years of your deception make trusting this sudden honesty difficult," he said. "I don't expect immediate trust," Ronan replied. "I only ask that you allow me to explain fully, and to offer what small measure of restitution remains possible, given everything that has already been done. Then explain the memory alteration in full detail, Cale said. Alira deserves to understand exactly what was done to her, and whether any lasting harm remains beyond the memories already returning naturally. Ronan nodded slowly, moving toward a small writing desk near the corner of the chamber, retrieving a leather-bound journal that he offered toward Alira, with visibly trembling hands. This contains detailed records of everything Celine and I did that night, he said, the specific compounds used, the exact nature of the binding ritual, and notes regarding how the suppression might eventually be reversed naturally through emotional triggers, exactly as you've already begun experiencing. Alira accepted the journal cautiously, flipping through several pages filled with dense, careful handwriting, detailing dates, ingredients, and observations about her adjustment to her new false identity over the following months. Seeing her own stolen history documented so clinically sent a fresh wave of anger through her, though she forced herself to focus on the practical value the information might offer. According to these notes, she said, scanning further through the pages, the suppression should fully dissolve within a matter of weeks, provided I continue encountering triggers connected to my true memories. There's no indication of permanent damage beyond the temporary disorientation I've already experienced. Cale released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, relief flooding through him at the confirmation that whatever harm had been done to Alira's mind was not permanent. That's something, at least, he said quietly, though his gaze remained hard and unforgiving as he turned back toward Ronan. What happens now? Ronan asked quietly, his earlier composure fully dissolved into something closer to resigned acceptance. I know I cannot undo the years already stolen, nor erase the pain caused by my actions, but I am prepared to face whatever judgment you believe is fair, Cale, whether that means imprisonment, exile once again, or something harsher still. Cale studied his half-brother for a long, considering moment, old anger, warring with the strange, unexpected relief of finally having answers after years of painful uncertainty. Your fate is not mine alone to decide, he said finally. Alira deserves a voice in whatever consequences follow, given that her stolen life sits at the center of everything you've done. All eyes turned toward Alira, who stood quietly holding the journal that documented the theft of her own identity, weighing the complicated mixture of anger, grief, and cautious relief churning within her. The weight of the decision settled heavily over the room, everyone present understanding that whatever she chose next would shape the final resolution of a betrayal that had spanned 5 painful years. Alira closed the journal slowly, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover as she considered the weight of the decision now resting in her hands. She looked up, first toward Ronan, whose expression carried a fragile mixture of hope and resignation, and then toward Cale, whose patient silence made clear that he would honor whatever choice she made, regardless of his own feelings on the matter. I don't want you dead, she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion still churning beneath the surface. And I don't believe endless imprisonment serves any real purpose beyond satisfying anger. I understand, but don't wish to build my future around. Ronan's shoulders eased slightly at her words, though he remained silent, sensing she was not yet finished speaking. But you cannot simply walk away from this without consequence, she continued. You stole 5 years of my life. You manipulated my adoptive parents, whether they knew it or not, into raising a child built entirely around a false history. You need to understand the full weight of what that cost me, not through punishment alone, but through genuine accountability. What are you proposing? Cale asked quietly, curious despite his own inclination toward harsher judgment. A formal trial, Alira said, conducted openly, with full transparency about everything that happened. Not a quiet exile that lets him disappear again, and not imprisonment that simply removes the problem without addressing it honestly. Let the truth be known publicly, let him answer for his actions in front of those affected by them, and let whatever judgment follows be decided through proper process rather than private vengeance. Cale considered her proposal carefully, recognizing both the fairness and the wisdom behind it. A public trial would not only hold Ronan accountable, but would also ensure that the truth of the scheme became widely known, preventing any future attempts to twist the narrative or claim innocence once the immediate crisis had passed. That seems a fair path forward, Cale said finally, turning toward Ronan. You will return with us, under guard, to face formal judgment before the full council of Northern Lords. Whatever verdict they reach, you will accept it without further attempts at deception or escape. Ronan nodded slowly, something like genuine relief flickering across his exhausted features. I accept those terms, he said quietly. Whatever judgment follows, I would rather face it honestly than continue living beneath the weight of lies I no longer have the strength to maintain. Celine, apparently, would not face the same public reckoning, having already secured her safe passage through her earlier bargain with Cale, though Finn made a quiet note to ensure her activities were monitored closely moving forward, wary that a woman skilled in memory manipulation might prove valuable or dangerous again in the future. As the tension in the chamber slowly eased, Nora stepped forward, addressing Ronan directly for the first time since their arrival. The letter I found, she said, about the healer's debt. Was that reference to Celine? Ronan nodded. Yes. I paid her generously for her assistance, though the debt referenced in that letter was actually owed to me by her, related to an earlier favor I had done on her behalf years before. It was careless of me to leave such evidence accessible. I suppose some part of me always feared, or perhaps hoped, that the truth would eventually surface, despite my efforts to keep it buried. The confession offered Alira a strange, bittersweet closure, understanding that even amid his elaborate deception, some fractured part of Ronan had perhaps always known the scheme could not remain hidden forever. It did not excuse his actions, but it offered a small measure of humanity within an otherwise devastating betrayal. With Ronan's surrender secured, and his remaining forces at the fortress quickly informed of the changed circumstances, the group began preparations for the journey back toward Cale's kingdom, where the promised trial would take place before the full council of Northern Lords. Callum, along with several other riders who had chosen to stand aside from the earlier confrontation, agreed to accompany the group as well, offering testimony that would prove valuable during the upcoming proceedings. As dawn broke over the western cliffs, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Alira found herself standing near the edge of the fortress battlements, watching the waves crash against the rocks far below. Cale approached quietly, coming to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than simple curiosity. Alira considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "Exhausted," she admitted. "Overwhelmed. Relieved, in some strange way, to finally understand the truth, even though that truth has upended everything I believed about my own life. And frightened, if I'm honest, about what comes next." "What frightens you most?" Cale asked softly. "Figuring out who I am now," Alira said, "separate from the false identity Ronan built for me, separate even from the woman you remember from 5 years ago. I'm not entirely either version anymore. I'm something new, shaped by both stolen memories and the life I actually lived these past 5 years, however built on lies it might have been." Cale turned to face her fully, his expression thoughtful and patient. "You don't have to figure that out immediately," he said. "Identity isn't something reclaimed in a single moment, or decided through a single conversation. It takes time, and I intend to give you exactly as much time as you need, without pressure or expectation." "Even though the bond between us is already so strong?" Alira asked, studying his face carefully. "Even though some part of you clearly wants nothing more than to simply reclaim what you believe was taken from you?" "Especially because of that," Cale said. "I spent 5 years grieving a bond I believed was broken forever. Now that you're here, alive and slowly remembering, the last thing I want is to repeat the same mistake that led to your original disappearance, rushing toward what I want, without fully considering what you need." Alira felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth entirely separate from the mysterious pull of the mate bond itself, something closer to genuine appreciation for a man willing to prioritize her healing over his own desires. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding that, even when it would be easier for you to simply insist we return immediately to whatever life we shared before. There's nothing easy about any of this," Cale admitted with a small, tired smile. "But you're worth every difficult moment, exactly as you are now, memories fully returned or not." They stood together in comfortable silence for several more minutes, watching the sun continue its slow climb above the horizon, before Finn approached to signal that the group was ready to begin their journey home. As they turned to rejoin the others, Alira found herself reaching for Cale's hand, an instinctive gesture that surprised her slightly with how natural it felt. Kale glanced down at their joined hands, then up toward her face, a quiet, hopeful smile spreading across his features as he gently squeezed her fingers in response. Whatever complicated path remained ahead, whatever difficult truth still needed processing, and whatever formal judgment awaited Ronan before the Council of Northern Lords, this small, simple gesture felt like the first genuine step toward reclaiming a future neither of them had ever truly given up hoping for, even through 5 long years of painful uncertainty. The journey back toward Kale's kingdom proved considerably calmer than their earlier travels, the immediate danger resolved, and replaced instead by the quieter, more complicated work of healing and rebuilding trust. Illyra spent much of the journey speaking quietly with Nora, processing the whirlwind of revelations from the past several days, while Kale rode nearby, giving her space to work through her emotions at her own pace, while remaining close enough to offer comfort whenever she needed it. They stopped briefly at the village near the mountains, where Nora had earlier sent word to Edmund and Clara Hale, allowing Illyra the opportunity to send a more detailed message, explaining at least a portion of the truth now surrounding her stolen memories. She chose her words carefully, wanting to reassure her adoptive parents of her safety, while acknowledging the complicated situation, without overwhelming them with details better explained in person once she returned. As the group continued their journey, drawing steadily closer to Kale's territory, Illyra found herself increasingly aware of small, unexpected flashes of memory continuing to surface. No longer the sharp, painful fragments of the attack itself, but softer moments, quiet mornings spent walking through northern forests, shared laughter during evenings beside crackling fires, the particular warmth of Kale's hand intertwined with her own during quiet moments neither of them had needed to fill with words. Each returning memory felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself, slowly rebuilding a fuller understanding of the woman she had been, before Ronan's scheme stole 5 years from her life. And with each memory, the bond connecting her to Kale grew steadier, more certain, less like a confusing, overwhelming pull, and more like a comfortable, familiar warmth, settling naturally into place. By the time the towers of Kale's kingdom finally came into view on the horizon, Illyra felt more prepared than she had at any point since the collapsed wedding, to face whatever remained ahead, the formal trial awaiting Ronan, the difficult conversations still needed with her adoptive parents, and the slow, careful process of building a genuine future, with the man whose golden eyes had first found her across a crowded wedding hall just days before, setting into motion the truth that would finally set her free. The kingdom greeted their return with a mixture of relief and confusion, news of the collapsed wedding having spread quickly through the northern territories in the days since the ceremony's dramatic interruption. Guards at the main gates bowed respectfully as the group passed through, though curious whispers followed them all the way to the central keep, servants and nobles alike straining for any glimpse of the mysterious woman who had apparently been the Alpha King's long-lost mate. Edmund and Clara Hale arrived at the kingdom 2 days after Illyra's return, having traveled swiftly once Nora's more detailed message reached them. Illyra met them in a private receiving room, her heart pounding with anxious uncertainty, as she waited to see how they would react to the complicated truth now surrounding her origins. Clara reached her first, pulling Illyra into a fierce embrace the moment she entered the room, tears already streaming down her weathered cheeks. "We were so worried," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When Nora's letter arrived, we didn't know what to think, only that something had happened at the wedding, and that you needed time before explaining further." Edmund followed close behind, his own eyes glistening with barely restrained emotion as he waited patiently for his turn to embrace his daughter. "Whatever truth you've discovered," he said quietly, "know that our love for you has never depended on the details of how you came into our lives." Illyra felt a fresh wave of emotion at their words, relieved beyond measure that the unconditional love she had always known from her adoptive parents remained steady, despite the unraveling of everything she had believed about her past. She spent the following hour explaining as much of the situation as she could, watching their expressions shift through shock, anger, and eventually a kind of sorrowful understanding, as the full scope of Ronan's deception became clear. "We had no idea," Clara said softly, once Illyra finished her explanation. "When we found you in the forest near the river crossing, injured and confused, we truly believed you had simply suffered an accident, exactly as the story suggested. If we had known someone had deliberately placed you there, orchestrated the entire circumstance of your discovery, We never would have simply accepted it without asking more questions. I know, Alira said gently, taking her mother's hand in her own. I don't blame either of you for any of this. You gave me a genuine home, genuine love, during years when I had no memory of anything else. That matters more than the circumstances that brought us together. Edmund nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. What happens now? He asked. With this king? With the life you apparently had before all of this happened? Alira glanced toward the door, aware that Cale waited just beyond it, giving her privacy for this difficult reunion with her parents. I don't fully know yet, she admitted honestly, but I know that whatever happens, I want you both to remain part of my life, exactly as you have been these past 5 years. This new truth doesn't erase the family we built together. The reassurance seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, and after a brief pause, Clara asked gently if she might meet the man responsible for so completely upending their daughter's understanding of her own history. Alira agreed, stepping out briefly to invite Cale into the room, watching nervously as her adoptive parents studied him with careful, protective scrutiny. To his credit, Cale approached the meeting with genuine humility, addressing both Edmund and Clara with sincere gratitude for the love and care they had given Alira during years when he himself had been unable to protect her. The initial tension gradually eased as the conversation continued, both sides recognizing that whatever complicated circumstances had brought them together, the shared goal of Alira's happiness and well-being united them more than any lingering uncertainty divided them. The formal trial took place 3 days later, held within the Grand Council chamber before an assembly of northern lords and representatives from allied pacts. Ronan stood before the assembled council, stripped of the confident bearing he had carried throughout most of his adult life, offering a full and detailed confession of his actions over the preceding 5 years. Alira testified as well, describing the fragmented memories that had gradually resurfaced during their journey. The emotional and psychological toll of discovering her entire identity had been carefully constructed around a lie. Celine's earlier confession, documented carefully by Finn during their confrontation at the fortress, was also presented as evidence, further confirming the elaborate scope of the deception. The council deliberated for the better part of a full day before reaching their final verdict. Rather than execution or permanent imprisonment, Ronan was sentenced to an extended period of exile, stripped formally of any remaining claim to succession or noble title, required to spend the coming years performing service to communities harmed by conflicts arising from his earlier political maneuvering. It was a judgment that balanced accountability with the possibility of eventual redemption, exactly the kind of fair, transparent resolution Alira had hoped for when she first proposed the formal trial. As guards led Ronan from the chamber to begin the terms of his exile, he paused briefly near where Alira and Cale stood together, offering one final, quiet word before departing. I hope, genuinely, that you find the happiness I was too selfish and afraid to earn honestly, he said, his voice carrying none of the earlier bitterness or manipulation that had defined so much of their previous interactions. Whatever else I've done, I do wish that for you both. Alira studied him for a long moment, searching for any remaining trace of deception, before finally offering a small, measured nod. I hope you find your own path forward as well, she said, one built on honesty rather than the schemes that led you here. With that, Ronan departed, escorted from the kingdom to begin the long process of exile and service the council had decreed, closing the final chapter of a betrayal that had shaped 5 painful years of both their lives. In the days following the trial, Alira found herself settling gradually into the rhythms of Cale's kingdom, reacquainting herself with a world that had once been entirely familiar and now felt both comfortingly recognizable and strangely new. Her memories continued returning steadily, no longer through painful, fragmented flashes, but through a gentler, more natural process of remembering, aided by quiet conversations with Cale and Finn about the life she had lived before her disappearance. She learned again the names of pack members who had once been close friends, rediscovered favorite places throughout the kingdom's forests and gardens, and slowly rebuilt a comfortable familiarity with the responsibilities and expectations that came with her position as Cale's intended mate. Nora remained close throughout this process, having decided to remain in the Northern Kingdom rather than return to her previous life, unwilling to abandon her closest friend during such a significant transition. One evening, Several weeks after the trial's conclusion, Kale found Illyra sitting quietly beside the same stream, where they had once spent countless evenings together, before her disappearance, now fully restored in her memory, alongside so many other treasured moments from their earlier courtship. He settled beside her without speaking, content simply to share the peaceful silence of the fading evening light. "I remember everything now," Illyra said softly, breaking the comfortable quiet between them. "Not just fragments anymore. The whole story, exactly as it happened, before Ronan's scheme tore it apart." Kale turned to look at her, hope and cautious relief mingling in his expression. "How does that feel?" he asked gently. "Strange," Illyra admitted. "Like reclaiming a part of myself I didn't fully realize was missing, even during the years I lived as someone else entirely. But it also feels like coming home, finally, after a very long journey." "Are you ready to talk about what comes next?" Kale asked carefully, unwilling to push her toward decisions she wasn't fully prepared to make. "About us? About the future, whatever that might look like?" Illyra turned to face him fully, studying the familiar warmth of his golden eyes, the quiet strength and patience he had shown throughout every difficult step of their journey together. "I think I am," she said softly. "I've spent these past weeks rebuilding an understanding of who I am, separate from the lies Ronan built around me. And through all of that rebuilding, one truth has remained constant. I love you, Kale. Not simply because of some ancient bond neither of us fully chose, but because of who you've proven yourself to be throughout everything we've faced together these past weeks." Kale's breath caught at her words. 5 years of grief and longing finally settling into something resembling peace. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He no longer felt any need to hide. "I have loved you since the moment we first met, and that love never wavered. Not through 5 years of believing you were gone, not through the shock and chaos of finding you again at another man's wedding." And Illyra reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, exactly as she had during countless quiet evenings before her disappearance, the gesture now carrying the full weight of reclaimed memory and freely chosen love, rather than simply the pull of an ancient, unexplained bond. "Then let's build our future properly this time," she said. "No secrets, no schemes, no stolen years, just the truth, exactly as it is." Kale raised their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his expression carrying a promise deeper than any formal vow could fully capture. "Exactly as it is," he agreed softly. "For as long as we both shall live." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and gold above the quiet stream where their story had first truly begun years before, Illyra felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the last remaining shadows of Ronan's deception finally giving way to a future built on genuine trust, hard-won understanding, and a love that had somehow survived 5 years of painful separation to find its way back home. Preparations for the new wedding began quietly at first, neither Kale nor Illyra wishing to rush into another grand ceremony so soon after the chaos of the first. Instead, they spent the following months simply living together, allowing their relationship to grow naturally within the rhythms of daily life, rather than forcing it into the formal structure of a rushed engagement. Illyra took on gradual responsibilities within the kingdom, working closely with Finn to understand the administrative duties that would eventually fall to her as Kale's mate and queen. She found unexpected fulfillment in the work, particularly in establishing new programs to support families affected by pack conflicts, drawing directly from her own experience of displacement and stolen identity to advocate for policies that prioritize transparency and accountability within the kingdom's justice system. Nora, meanwhile, settled comfortably into her own role within the Northern Kingdom, eventually finding purpose working alongside Finn in coordinating the kingdom's growing network of alliances with neighboring packs. The friendship between the two women remained strong throughout this transition, a steady constant amid so much change and rebuilding. Edmund and Clara visited frequently, gradually becoming familiar and welcome faces throughout the kingdom, their genuine warmth and humility earning them respect among the northern nobility, despite their unfamiliarity with formal pack customs. Illyra cherished these visits deeply, grateful that the truth of her stolen past had not cost her the family who had raised her with such unconditional love. News occasionally reached the kingdom regarding Ronan's progress through his period of exile, reports suggesting he had thrown himself seriously into the service work required by his sentence, rebuilding communities in the Southern Territories that had suffered during earlier conflicts tied to his political ambitions. Whether his transformation reflected genuine remorse or simply pragmatic acceptance of his circumstances remained uncertain. But Alira found herself hoping, quietly and without any lingering resentment, that he might eventually find a version of redemption worth the effort he seemed to be investing. As the one-year anniversary of their reunion approached, Cale proposed formally, though both of them understood the gesture as more ceremonial than necessary, given how deeply committed they had already become to building a life together. Alira accepted, with a joy unclouded by the confusion and uncertainty that had marked their earlier, interrupted attempt at marriage, and preparations began in earnest for a wedding that would finally reflect the full truth of their bond. The ceremony took place on a clear autumn afternoon, held not within the grand formal hall where the earlier false wedding had unraveled, but instead in the quiet meadow beside the stream, where Cale and Alira had first fallen in love years before, and where they had later found their way back to each other during the difficult weeks following her return. The setting felt far more fitting than any grand hall could have offered, intimate and meaningful, in ways that honored the true story of their connection, rather than simply the political spectacle their first attempted wedding had represented. Nora stood once again as maid of honor, though this time her earlier nervousness had given way to genuine, unclouded joy as she helped Alira prepare for the ceremony. Edmund walked his daughter through the meadow toward where Cale waited, his expression carrying quiet pride and happiness, entirely different from the anxious uncertainty that had marked the earlier, false ceremony. Finn stood beside Cale as his chosen witness, having earned that honor through years of unwavering loyalty and the crucial role he had played in helping uncover the truth of Alira's stolen past. The gathered guests, a smaller and more intimate group than the grand assembly that had witnessed the earlier collapsed wedding, watched with genuine warmth as the priest began the familiar opening words of the ceremony once more. This time, when the priest asked if any present objected to the union, the silence that followed carried none of the practiced formality of the earlier ceremony, but instead, a genuine, collective certainty that no objection could possibly exist to a bond so thoroughly tested and proven true. Alira looked up at Cale as they exchanged their vows, her voice steady and clear, carrying none of the confusion and uncertainty that had marked her words during the earlier, interrupted ceremony. "I promise to build our future on truth," she said, "exactly as we agreed beside the stream months ago. No secrets, no schemes, only the honest, hard-won love we've fought so carefully to reclaim." Cale's own vows carried similar weight, a promise built not on ancient bonds or fated destiny alone, but on the genuine choice both of them had made, repeatedly, throughout the difficult months of rebuilding trust and understanding following her return. "I promise to cherish not just the mate fate gave me," he said, "but the woman you chose to become, through everything you endured and everything you rebuilt afterward. My love for you has never been about destiny alone. It has always been, and will always be, about you." As they exchanged the final formal words binding them together, the meadow around them seemed to hold its breath, the golden autumn light filtering softly through the surrounding trees, casting warm shadows across the gathered guests, who watched with genuine happiness, rather than the uncertain tension that had defined the earlier ceremony. When the priest finally pronounced them bonded, mates and spouses in the full sense recognized by both pack tradition and formal law, the meadow erupted into joyful celebration, guests cheering and embracing as Cale pulled Alira close, sealing their vows with a kiss that carried the full weight of everything they had overcome to reach this moment. The celebration continued long into the evening, music and laughter filling the meadow as guests mingled freely, sharing stories and well wishes for the newly bonded couple. Alira spent much of the evening moving between conversations with her adoptive parents, her closest friend, and the various pack members and allies who had played roles, large and small, in helping her reclaim the truth of her stolen identity. Late in the evening, as the celebration began winding down and guests slowly departed toward their prepared accommodations within the kingdom, Cale found Alira standing quietly near the edge of the meadow, watching the last golden light of sunset fade slowly into the deepening blue of early evening. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her, echoing gently the vulnerability of a question he had first considered asking her many months before, during the earliest, most uncertain days following her return. Alira turned to look at him, studying the familiar warmth of his golden eyes, now free of the earlier grief and uncertainty that had shadowed them for so many years. "None," she said simply. "Every difficult moment, every painful memory reclaimed, every uncertain step through everything we faced together, all of it led us exactly here, to this moment. I wouldn't trade any of it, even the pain, if it meant losing the truth we finally found on the other side." Cale pulled her close, wrapping his arms gently around her, as the last light of day finally faded fully into evening, stars beginning to emerge softly overhead. "Neither would I," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever brought us to this moment, however painful and complicated the path, I would walk through every bit of it again, exactly as it happened, if it meant finding my way back to you in the end." They stood together in comfortable silence, as the stars slowly filled the darkening sky above the meadow, the same quiet stream flowing gently nearby, where their story had first begun years before, and where, against every obstacle placed deliberately in their path, they had finally found their way back to each other, stronger and more certain than ever, ready to build a future together, built entirely on truth, trust, and a love that had proven, beyond any doubt, strong enough to survive even the most carefully constructed lies. And as the newly bonded king and queen of the Northern Pax walked hand in hand back toward the warm lights of the celebration still glowing softly in the distance, the long, difficult journey that had begun so painfully at a wedding built on deception finally reached its true and rightful conclusion, not with the ending of a stolen story, but with the joyful beginning of the honest one they had fought so hard to reclaim.